Welcome, everyone. So my name is Josh Reeves, and I work in the Center for Science and Religion. We're very excited to have you here tonight. Depending on how you look at it, this is either the 5th or 6th lecture in our Science and Religion lecture series that we've had over the past 2 years. It's been sponsored by generous grants from the John Templeton Foundation and the Issachar Fund, so we're very excited to continue our lecture series tonight. We still have one more year of funding, so keep an eye out on our website for next year, more exciting speakers on topics of science and religion, okay? So tonight we're very excited to have Dr. John Walton, Old Testament professor from Wheaton. He's a prolific scholar. If you look on his Amazon page, many books, the Lost World series, Lost World of Genesis 1, Lost World of Adam and Eve, all sorts of books. He asked me to keep this short, so I'm not going to list all the books that he's written, but he is a prolific scholar, not only on Genesis, but on how Genesis and the creation narratives bear on modern discussions of science. So that's why we wanted him here today. Before he was at Wheaton, he's taught 20 years at Moody Bible College, and so he has long experience both in the academic classroom and in ministry settings of helping Christians think about Genesis and how it might relate to the modern world. So tonight we're very excited to have Dr. John Walton.
Well, good evening. Thank you for coming on this beautiful evening. You know, I came down from Chicago and well, it's just not fun being outside there yet, but here it's just beautiful in your lovely campus, so it's very nice to be here. Now, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to get right into it. When we ask the kind of question of what Genesis can and cannot say to Christians today, we have to start with the question of what kinds of claims does the Bible make and how does it make them? Okay, because that's what it has to say. It's based on what kind of claims it can make. Now, if we want to know what kind of claims it makes and it can make, then we have to start with the basic idea of biblical authority. I start with the idea of biblical authority, and I suspect most of you do as well. And we have to know how that works. I mean, it's one thing to say the Bible has authority, but exactly how does that work? And that is what's going to dictate what information we draw from it. So, when we start into our discussion of biblical authority, we have to understand that God's purpose in communication is carried out through the human author's purpose. That's how God chose to do it. He could have done it other ways, but that's how God chose to do it. He chose to use human communicators vested with his authority. And as a result, whatever it was that they intended to say, they're saying with God's authority. That's how God's purpose comes to us. Therefore, we have to be very attentive to the human author, because that human author is vested with the authority of God. And so whatever that author intended to say has God's authority behind it. Now, what this demonstrates to us is something that we need to be vitally aware of, and that is that the Bible was written for us, but it was not written to us. It's written for us because God was revealing himself for all of humanity in all time. So it's written for us like it's written for everyone, but it's not written to everyone. It's not written to us. It's not in our language. It's not in our culture. It's against a different culture and a different time. And so while its message transcends culture, its form is culture-bound. We're reading someone else's mail. And it's okay, we're allowed to, but we have to recognize that that is what we're doing. So for us to benefit from the authoritative message of God's Word, what we have to do is join the audience that literature is written to, because it's assuming their context. And so we have to try to join that audience. Now, that's how we are going to find out what the Bible has to say to us. What it has to say to them then is appropriated for us so that we can understand what it has to say to us. But it is talking to them, not to us. So, that means we have to look into the Bible and the ancient world, what we call its cultural context, or when I'm talking to my students, what I call its cognitive environment. Ugh. Okay, you get the idea. We have to try to understand that world, a world different from ours. And when we do that, we have to do it carefully, but we do have to try to make that transition. We don't just kind of pick up that ancient Near East and import it into the text and impose it on the text. The text is already in that context. Okay, so we're not talking about borrowed literature, how the Bible borrowed from the ancient Near East. I don't give that any attention at all. We're talking about how the Israelites are immersed in the ancient world. I mean, after all, they're not immersed in our world, and this all meant something to them. So we're not imposing this material on the biblical text. Matter of fact, if we read without that information, we are imposing our culture on the biblical text, our ideas, our worldview, because nobody reads culture free. So we have to be careful, because if we're reading our culture into the text, then we are imposing something on it, and we're clouding the authority issue. So the ancient Near Eastern texts can prompt us to think about the biblical text differently, because the ancient Near Eastern texts give us a window into that ancient worldview. They give us glimpses. Without the ancient Near Eastern texts, we wouldn't be able to do this. And we didn't have the ancient Near Eastern texts until a little over 100 years ago. So this is a relatively new discipline. And for the first 75, 80 years, they were just trying to translate the things and work out all of those ideas. So this idea that they give us windows into how people thought and how they lived in the ancient world, very important as we approach the material. So, for some examples, okay? Wow, we have to see the world the way they saw the world. Picture of blue earth there. Show that to an ancient Israelite, they would have no idea what they were looking at. Ooh, pretty colors. Right? They don't know what that is. They don't know what anything on that is. That's not the world they know. And they wouldn't represent it that way, and they would not be able to interpret that picture. And God did not give them that picture. As true as we might think it is, God didn't give them that picture. He was content to work within the frame of the picture they had. What would that picture look like? Well, let's start with Egypt. And that'll give us a little something to work with, and then we'll move to Israel. So if we think about the Egyptian picture, okay, you can see on your left, that's something from a tomb painting. And it's a fairly common kind of picture. It's their cosmology. On the right is my son's artist work to reproduce it in kind of a modern genre. But they're both portraying the same basic thing. So what we find is that we've got the sky god arched over the top. That's a solid sky. You can see that the stars are emblazoned on her body. And that's what they believed about the stars, that they were inscribed on the underside of a solid sky. That solid sky is holding up waters. You can see the waters on that picture, all those dots to the left. Okay, and so there is the waters above. Everybody in the ancient world believed there were waters above and waters below. It's just how they thought. And of course, it made sense because a solid sky is holding up waters. There must be waters up there because they come down sometimes. So they have to be up there. And they don't come down all the time, so there must be some kind of something that has come down sometime and not other times. And they tried to work all this out, but they've got no means to do that. So there's water up there, water above, water below, okay? And we've got the earth god prone at the bottom. We've got the air god holding the sky and the earth apart. Okay, and that's an important cosmological function as well. We've got the sun god sailing across the cosmic waters above. This is how Egyptians thought about the world, far from our blue earth. And you can see that when you portray a cosmic geography, you include those things which have value in your way of thinking. So you can see that this picture is filled with the gods. And that reflects their values, their way of understanding the world around them. Now, of course, the Israelites are not going to think quite that way because they don't have a view that it's all filled with gods. If we turn to the Israelite view, we find a very different kind of perspective. So that's a little bit dark for you to see, but that's again, my son's working here at pulling all the information that he can from biblical texts in order to convey how an Israelite would have thought about it. Up at the top there, that's the heavenly temple. It's founded on the waters, as Psalm says, on the waters above. The light beam is a connection between the earthly temple and the heavenly temple. We've got a single continent surrounded by mountains and surrounded by waters. The waters above flow into the waters below. We've got Sheol down below, which you can barely see, and the pillars of the earth are there as well. You can also barely make out the Leviathan swirling around in the depths. All of these come out of biblical texts. This is the way that an Israelite would have thought about the world. Now, an Egyptian looking at this would have understood exactly what's going on. Not enough gods, but they would have understood this picture. Israelites looking at the Egyptian one would have understood that picture. But neither of them would understand our blue earth. In other words, they have more in common with each other than they do with us. And so we have to try to read their texts against their world, because God was not upgrading them. There was no cosmic geography 3.2, no upgrades. So we have to think about the world the way they thought about the world. We also have to think about the text the way they thought about the text. We can't give Hebrew words modern scientific meaning. Now, Hugh Ross was here a little while ago, and this is something I disagree with Hugh on. He wants to vest ancient words with modern meaning. And we won't go into all of that. But that's a distinction. My contention is that the authority is in what the Hebrew communicator meant. And that means we're tied to what those Hebrew words meant. If God had other meaning in those words, we've got no access to whatever meaning he might have had. We can't just assume that the meaning he had is one that coincides with the way we view the world. So we have to read the text the way they read the text. So that moves us in then to a consideration of how do we think about the Bible and science. If we have to think in ancient terms and we have to think of words as ancient words, then how in the world do we begin talking about the Bible and science? Well, we have to recognize that the Bible is not trying to anticipate our science and address it directly. That's not what the Bible does. It's written to them. It's in their world. And there are lots of ways that they thought differently than what we do. So let's start with something that's very significant for the aspects of science, the idea of natural and supernatural. We very easily divide phenomena, events, experiences into natural and supernatural. We talk about the natural as things that pertain to natural cause and effect and natural laws, and the things that sort of happen regularly on their own. And then we talk about supernatural, which we insist means things that cannot be explained naturally and therefore must involve acts of God. And we go through the Bible and we pick out things that are natural and supernatural. Okay? That's typically how we work. At least since the Enlightenment, it's how we work. The ancient world has no such categories. In the ancient world, God is doing everything. There's no such thing as natural laws. There's no such thing as natural cause and effect. God is doing everything. So in the ancient world, they don't have a word for miracle, because a miracle fits into the supernatural-natural divide. A miracle is something that can only be explained by God act, not explained by natural. Miracle assumes this divide in terms. Intervention assumes this divide. When we talk about God intervening, we're talking about him doing something supernatural, intervening into a natural world to interfere with it. That can't happen in the ancient world of thinking, because to intervene, you have to be outside. To intervene, you have to be not a part of it. It has to be happening apart from you, and then you intervene. So the Bible doesn't talk about miracles, it talks about signs and wonders. These are evidences of God's power, of God's love, of God's care for his people, of God's deliverance. They speak of God's activity, but they're not designated miracles. And God's not intervening because you can't intervene in something that you are doing. I can't intervene in this lecture. I'm giving it. So we've got a way of thinking in the ancient world that is very different from how we think. If we're going to say what Genesis can and cannot say, if we're going to talk about Genesis claims, we can't really say that Genesis makes a claim that some things are supernatural instead of natural. It can't make that claim if they don't have those categories. It's certainly saying God is involved, but of course it's saying God is involved because God's involved in everything. So, as we think about this whole area of science in the Bible, we have to be aware that we're dealing with an ancient document. The observation, then, of natural cause and effect doesn't remove God from the picture. We're going on the other side now. Just because we can identify something as being in our category of natural doesn't mean God's not acting. Are we really going to say that those things that we consider natural laws, that God has nothing to do with them? You say, well, he set them up. Well, deists think that. We don't usually consider ourselves that. So in Psalm 139, you knit me together in my mother's womb. That talks about God's activity. And we certainly wouldn't believe that just because we can figure out all the details of embryology and the cause and effect processes that cause a fetus to grow in the womb into a child, just because we can figure that out, doesn't mean God didn't do it. So just because we can observe natural cause and effect doesn't remove God from the picture. And I would suggest to you then that in the Bible we have no scientific revelation. Science is the way we think. It's not the way they think. And God's not going to upgrade them. No matter where you turn in the Old Testament, you won't find anything that pushes them beyond kind of the normal ways that people thought about the world in the ancient world. There's nothing that says, all those people around you, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, they think this way, but really it's this way. Theology, yes. Science, no. God is perfectly content to work within their framework and the way that they think. I've got the word heart there, and that's a great example. In the ancient world, they have no idea of the physiology of the brain. For them, all the things that we attach to the physiology of the brain, they believe happened in the heart, the kidney, the liver, the entrails. And of course, they had no idea of the physiology of the liver or no idea of the physiology of the kidneys. They had a different physiology, at least a different understanding of physiology than we do. And God didn't upgrade them. Instead, God talks about believing with the heart and loving with the heart. And we say that's a metaphor. For us, it is. For them, it was physiology. They don't even have the word physiology, but that's what it was. So we see evidence then that God did not give them upgraded information, no revelation about things like meteorology or physiology or epidemiology, cosmic geography, any of the things that we consider the sciences. God just let it be. They'll figure it out sooner or later. What he's interested in telling them is his activity, his agency. We'll talk more about that in a couple minutes. So, as a result of this, if the Bible's not a science textbook, if the Bible does not anticipate our science, if the Bible doesn't have scientific revelation in it, then we have to be very careful about what we say that the Bible claims, about what the Bible can teach us. So we have to think about that carefully. Now, what I want to do now is, let's back that up, is give you just a quick summary. Again, we're limited on our time. I want to give you a quick summary of how these general insights about authority, about the way we approach the text, about science in the Bible, how these have given me a different perspective on Genesis 1 and 2. Usually when we have more time, I can try to demonstrate each of these points, and I don't have time for that, but I can at least summarize for you and maybe whet your appetite, and you can always find more information in my books where I give a fuller discussion of it. So the first thing that I do when I look at Genesis 1, I ask the question, how do they think about creation in the ancient world? Now, after all, we're used to thinking about that in very material terms. We're used to thinking that creation is a material activity that makes objects out of nothing. And that that's what creation is. It's material, it's object-focused. Well, I've become convinced that in the Bible, that is not the case. They are not object-focused. They are order-focused. And I've found that to be true also throughout the rest of the ancient Near East. You look at the biblical account in Genesis 1, the 7 days, and you'll notice that there's very few of the days that pertain to objects. Day 1, God creates time. Day 2, God says, let there be this weather system that works. He creates a space, an empty space. That's not an object. Day 3, he just says, let the dry land appear. Doesn't say that he made it. He did, by the way, but that's not what this story is about. Day 4, he talks about sun, moon, and stars. We say, aha, ha, objects. Yes, we think they are. And we're pretty confident that they are. They didn't know that. Remember I told you the stars engraved on the underside of the sky god's body? They're not objects. Sun and moon, do they know what those are? Do they know that the moon is a rock in space, reflecting the light of the sun, rotating, revolving? Absolutely not. They don't know those are objects. They don't know the sun is a burning ball of gas. They don't know they're objects. So when they talk about God making the sun, moon, and stars, what do they call them? In Genesis 1, lights, because that's what they are. Interesting, huh? Let the waters in the sky swarm. Doesn't say God made them. Now, he did, of course. But what I'm trying to point out is that this story, this creation account, is not really about the objects. It's about bringing order in the world. So in this functional focus that I suggest, that it's more about how things function within an ordered system, the purposes that they have. The Bible is really strong about the idea of purpose. Biology, not so much. A difference in perspective. In the ancient functional focus, existence, even existence, is defined by having a function. The Egyptians refer to the non-existent. Well, that's interesting. What are they talking about? They're talking about the desert. They're talking about the Mediterranean Sea. Non-existent. You say, but wait, those exist? Yes, if you use the criteria we do, which is a material criteria. But if you use their criteria, it makes sense. They're not part of the ordered system as they understood it. They don't have a sense of the purpose of these things, so they don't exist. It doesn't exist until it's given a purpose and a function in an ordered system, and that is creation in the ancient world. So when God keeps saying it's good, he's saying it's functioning properly, the way it's supposed to, the way I designed it, according to its purpose. This is not the word for perfect, folks. Not the word for perfect. Functioning properly. So Genesis 1, I propose, provides an account of functional origins, the origins of order, not material origins. God's bringing about order into the midst of non-order. I use the example here of, when you move into a new place. There you are with boxes all over the place. My daughter and son-in-law just moved into a new house last week. Boxes, boxes, boxes. No order whatsoever. And therefore, things can't function very well. They can't carry out their purpose. Everything's in boxes. And so there's an ordering process. Those boxes aren't evil, by the way, although sometimes they feel like they might be. But they're not evil, but there's no order there. It's not like they created non-order. It's still in the boxes. And you bring about order, and that's a creative activity in the ancient world. And so God makes it all work. Work as what? We'll get to that in a moment. So, it's fruitless then to ask what things, what objects God made on each day. If it's not a story about objects, then that's just the wrong question. We're asking a modern question instead of an ancient question. Material reality, then, is not the only reality. Material reality is not the only reality. That's our world screaming at us. It's materialism. That's certainly not the ancient world. The material aspects of the world around them was simply not very important to them. You say, do people really think that way? Well, sure they do. Matter of fact, sometimes you still think that way. Unless you're a chemistry major, you probably have never asked about the polymers that make up your laptop case. Oh, that's the material world. Aren't you interested? No, you're interested in apps and operating systems. You're interested in how it works. Material? Who cares? So sometimes it still shows up for us as well. So a way to help us understand this distinction between order and function and purpose on one hand and material and objects on the other hand is the distinction that we draw in English between a house and a home. Okay, we could talk about building a house, and we know what that involves. That's all of the electricity and the air conditioning, the gas, the plumbing, the walls, the foundations, the roof, right? A house, the material aspects of it. But you can build a house and be all done it, and there it stands empty, if it hasn't been sold yet. Well, since 2008, yeah, that's kind of it. Okay, hasn't been sold yet, and there it is. It exists materially, but it has no function or purpose. It's prepared to act in that way, to be used in that way, but it's not being used that way. And so there you have material, but no function. It's not that the plumbing doesn't work, it does, but there's no one to turn on the faucets. That's the house side of it. And when scientists talk about origins, they want to study the house. I'm glad they do. We need people doing that. It's been very beneficial. But that's what they want to do. So they think, and today many of us think about origins as a house story. God building the house. Well, God did build the house, but I don't think Genesis 1 is that story. Genesis 1, I would suggest, is the home story. Making a home is likewise an act of creation. It's the one that has to do with order and function and purpose. When we moved into our particular home, there was a room just off the kitchen which had been built to be a formal dining room. There were lots of things that indicated that, from the chandelier to the chair rails and things of that sort. It was built to be a dining room. We didn't want a formal dining room. We had no use for a formal dining room. So we turned it into a den. We furnished it like a den. We call it the den. We use it as a den. It's a den. We created a den. That's a function and purpose issue. Making a home is different than building a house. Both of them are acts of creation, and arguably, the home part is more important than the house part. So I would suggest that Genesis 1 is a home story, not a house story. It's a different kind of origins account than we would give. It's a different kind of origins account than science can deal with. But it's the most important origins account from an ancient worldview and from a biblical view. What then can Genesis tell Christians today? It can talk about the home. Now, whose home is it? We're still waiting to hear that piece of information. Well, it's real interesting when we get to the end of the 7 days, we get to day 7, I should say, and we're baffled. God rested. What in the world is going on? Why in the world would God need to rest? I mean, he doesn't need a break. He doesn't get tired. What's happening here? And then when we can't answer that question, we say, so what does this have to do with creation? In fact, many people talk about the 6 days of creation, precisely because they have no clue what to do with day 7. Well, God's not doing anything there. He's not making objects. Well, see, maybe we've been approaching that the wrong way. If it's not about making objects, if it's about function and purpose and order, then we have to ask, what does rest have to do with those things? Now, at this point, we discover something that we don't know about the ancient world. What we can know, it's there, but we read our Bibles and we don't. And it really helps resolve lots of these questions. In the ancient world, gods rest in temples. See, we wouldn't know that. Christians reading our Bible, I just read it straight out as it is. that's information you don't have, you don't know. And so rest is baffling. But in the ancient world, God's rest in temples, and in fact, temples are built for gods to rest in. That's an ancient cylinder seal showing the construction of a temple. So the minute it talks about divine rest, any ancient reader would know it's talking about temple. It's talking about sacred space. Well, that throws a different light on it. Not only do the gods rest there, we find out that resting does not entail relaxing in the temple. They do that because the private quarters of the gods are in the temples as well. But that's not the main important thing about the temples. The temples are the command center of the cosmos. And when the God rests in the temple, he is taking up the rule of the temple, of the cosmos. We've got an analogy, of course. We've now got several people trying to rest in the White House. And they don't care if they sleep in the Lincoln bedroom. They don't really care if they move their families into the residential quarters. They want the Oval Office because that's where they rule. And the rest of the president in the White House has to be understood as rule. So that's how it was in the ancient world. So when God's resting, he's not taking a break. When God's resting, he's taking up his rule of the cosmos in an ordered system that he has set up precisely for that rule. Some people say, oh, well, what did God do on the 8th day? He ruled. What did he do the 9th day? He ruled. He ruled. That's what that's all about. We won't do it now, but you can turn to Psalm 132 and talk about God's temple, his dwelling place, his resting place. There I will rule, enthroned. The Bible knows this. You know it if you read that part of the Bible, and you just have to connect the pieces. So the theology of rest in the Bible is not a theology of relaxation. When God says he'll give his people rest from their enemies, that's not naps. That's order. And so God is bringing about this stability for them. So God ceases his ordering activity, days 1 through 6, he ceases his ordering activity to now take command. That's the rest. In that sense, when we think about what's going on, the climax of the 6 days is people. That is, God is setting it all up to function for people, ordered for people to live there, okay? But the climax of creation is God's rest, because just because people can live there doesn't mean it's running the way it's supposed to. It's supposed to run as God's place. It's sacred space. A lot of important theology there that we miss entirely. We're too busy talking about biology or astronomy, physics. The main goal of creation is rest. Creation is ordering. Rest is God ruling in that ordered system. Resting occurs in an ordered system when it's under control. And that's exactly what God does in the 6 days. It is engagement, not disengagement. We read the word rest and we think, oh, okay, he's backing off. No. Rest, entering that temple, taking up his residence and his reign, that's engagement, not disengagement. When Jesus says, come unto me, all you who labor, heavy laden, and I will give you, not naps, rest. Take my yoke upon you, engaging, not disengaging. The rest that God gives then resolves unrest. Unrest is when it's lacking order. So when we talk about the genre of Genesis 1, we need to talk about cosmology. It's a temple text. It sees a reality beyond just the physical and material world. We need to move rapidly. So the 7 days. Okay, if this is an account that's not about objects, not about the material cosmos, it's about bringing order, then it's not talking about 7 days over which the material cosmos came into being. God did that, but this isn't that story. That's not what the 7 days are. Temple building, they built the temple over however long it takes. 7 years Solomon took. But then it's not really a temple yet. It's just ready to be a temple. And it's the temple inauguration that turns that structure into a temple as God comes and takes up his residence in it. And therefore, it's the temple inauguration that establishes the order and the purpose and the function. And those temple inaugurations, at times, including in the Bible, take 7 days. 7 days, then, isn't for the building of the physical material. It's not the house story. 7 days is for the home story, to inaugurate it as God's place. If that's so, then, day suggests, fine, it's a 24-hour period. I don't have a problem with that. But what's happening in those 24-hour days? Not the material, but the functional. So that wouldn't pertain to the age of the earth, because the age of the earth is a material question. What can Genesis say to modern Christians and cannot? Well, it can't tell us the age of the earth if Genesis 1 is not the house story. If the 7 days is like a temple inauguration, then the objects are not necessarily being made in those 7 days. If the days are concerned with bringing order rather than making things, the 7 days has nothing to do with the age of the earth. The Bible simply does not make a claim. Adam and Eve, boy, we need to go fast. Okay, so with Adam and Eve, I would suggest that everything that's going on with the human origins piece is archetypal, not biological. Now, exactly what do I mean by that? Okay? First of all, we can see that their names themselves are archetypal. Adam did not call Eve, Eve, and Eve did not call Adam, Adam. I know that for sure. I was there. No, I wasn't. I'm going to vote for Honey and Sweetie, but I'm not sure. I don't know the Hebrew. Okay, but I know it wasn't Adam and Eve, because those are Hebrew words. And Hebrew did not exist till the middle of the second millennium. It did not come into being as a language. So way back before Moses, they couldn't have called each other Adam and Eve. That means those names are given names, given by a Hebrew audience much later in time. And that means that those names were given to them for the meanings that they carried, human and life. And therefore we have the reflection of an Israelite author and an Israelite audience. Those are archetypal names. Now, they're not just prototypes, not just the first ones off the line. Archetype, I use the example of mothers. Second graders were asked, what are mothers made of? And they understood right away that was an archetypal question. What are mothers made of? It doesn't mean your individual mother, even though you have one. Okay, but mothers. And they gave answers like angel wings, and clouds, and string. Ingredients, but don't go biology on me here. Okay, the second graders weren't talking about biology. They really were talking about things that to them represented the identity of a mother. And that's what archetype does. Archetype pertains to identity, not biology, not material origins, but identity. And I'm proposing that we have the same thing in Genesis 2. From dust, from the side of man, these are identity issues, not biology, not material origins. The forming accounts then are relevant to them as archetypes. Now, they're identified as archetypal if those things pertain to everyone. We usually think that, well, dust, that's Adam, but that's not anybody else. The rest of us were born of woman. It's Adam that's dust, and that's sort of uniquely about him. But is that so? Is that what the Bible tells us? That's what we have to explore. Look at this verse from Psalm 103. For he knows how we are formed. He remembers that we are dust. We are dust. Every one of us is dust. Being formed from dust does not describe material formation, because I suspect all of you are born of a woman, yet you're still made from dust. That means formed from dust is not descriptive of your biological origins. Being formed from dust would not preclude being born of a woman. It doesn't for you, and it doesn't necessarily for Adam either. I just solved the belly button question, by the way. You're welcome. Think about that one. It's not our material origin, but it's identity that's involved. Dust has to do with identity. Dust you are, and to dust you shall return. Even Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, first man from dust and all from dust. This pertains to all of us. It's intended to communicate what all humans are. That's the archetype. Just like all mothers, all humans. Not what Adam uniquely was. Now, if the details of the forming apply to archetypes, we have no information about biological origins. And why would we think we should? They don't anticipate our issues. They don't anticipate our science. They don't draw a distinction between natural or supernatural. God's involved no matter what. Archetypal identity does not negate the existence of the individual. I believe Adam and Eve are real people in a real past. But that's not the question. The question is about material origins. So, is this what people really are? A focus on identity. Yes, we are mortal, we are frail, we are dust. Okay? A&E, by the way, the ancient Near East, also focuses on archetypal ingredients every time the issue is discussed. So it matches with what we know from the ancient world. So how should we think? We have to recognize what the biblical claims are and are not. We have to accept those who may choose different interpretations. There are a variety of ways to interpret this material by people being faithful to the biblical text. And we should understand that the acceptance of science does not require the rejection of the Bible or faith. The two are not necessarily in disagreement here. Now, let's clarify the difference on my last slide here. What we are saying, and what I think the Bible says pretty clearly, is that God has made us more than what he made us from. Now notice God is in both parts of that sentence. God's the one doing the making. But whether he made us from amino acids in a primordial soup, or whether he made us from a line of primates, or whether he made us straight from dust, whatever God made us from, the important point is that first God is doing the work and that he made us more than that. Someone who believes in evolution and is secular will stand in front of the gibbon cage and say, yeah, that's what I am. I'm a primate. Same-o, same-o. A Christian who adopts evolution will stand in front of the same gibbon cage and say, there, but for the grace of God am I. Because God has made us more. Those who think that God made us right from dust, pick up the dust and filter it through their hands. But for the grace of God, God has made us more. Now, in that sense, what's going on is that the Bible is talking about agency, not mechanism. The Bible is talking about agency. God is the agent. God has made us. God is the agent, but the mechanism is not described. Now, you might say, well, yes, it is. God formed him from dust. I just tried to explain that in my understanding, that pertains to not the biological mechanism, but it pertains to an archetypal identity. And we never find the Bible talking about scientific mechanisms. So the Bible talks about agency. That's what creation is about. Creation is about agency. God, no way leaving him out of the picture. But it leaves mechanism unaddressed. Evolution is one suggestion that deals with mechanism. When you think about this idea of agency and God making us more, we see that this is a pattern in the Bible. So Israel's identity, my father was a wandering Aramaean, or my father was an Amorite, my mother was a Hittite. Those are what Israel came from, the ethnic stock they came from. And that's how God made them as a people. But he made them more when he chose them to be his people. He made them more than what he made them from. And likewise, even our Christian identity, our identity in Christ is where God has made us more than what we were. Some of us, Paul tells us, some of us were murderers and some of us were adulterers and thieves. But God chose us and bought us with the blood of Christ and made us more than what we were. And the old has passed away. The new has come. We are new creation. We are crucified with Christ, and nevertheless we live. And so we find that even our Christian identity is founded on the idea that God has made us more than what he made us from. And so in that sense, we can try to understand what the true issues are. What can Genesis tell us or not tell us? It can tell us the important theology of God's agency, of God's rule, of God as creator of all the order that we see. That's what Genesis is talking about. And so Genesis tells us those things. We have other texts and other logic that leads us to understand God as the material creator as well. But that's really not Genesis' focus. And God has made us as human beings his image. God has made us more by giving us his image. He's made us more than what he made us from. Thank you.
All right, we have 7 minutes for questions. As we ask questions, you should have gotten an evaluation when you walked in. It'd be very helpful for us as we report back to our grant agency for you to fill that in. And as you leave through the back doors, there's a table on the right, and there'll be a cardboard box to leave those in as you leave. So that'd be very helpful for us. Thank you.
Also, if I could encourage you to keep the questions short and to the point so we can get as many in as possible.
The concept of a miracle certainly is a big part of the New Testament. Has the worldview of the Hebrews changed so much by then?
Yes, there are a lot of changes that take place between Old and New Testament. They go through the Persian period, they go through the Hellenistic period, they're into the Greco-Roman period. Aristotle and Plato have had their impact, and things are different there. Although, it's also interesting to look at the words that are translated miracle in the New Testament, and again, often it's signs. Okay. Other questions? Wow. All right, here's one. Yeah. Okay.
Bereshith, beginning of time, beginning of the story.
Okay, the word Bereshit is the first word of the Hebrew Bible, in the beginning. And so we ask the beginning of what? A very logical question. What we find is that when we take a look at the Hebrew word, we find that it doesn't refer to a point in time, it refers to a period. And it refers to an initial period. And that refers to the 7 days. So the beginning that's referred to, Genesis 1:1, nothing happens in Genesis 1:1. Genesis 1:1 is an introduction, a literary introduction to the chapter. So in the initial period, God created the cosmos. Let me tell you how he did it. Started out non-order, verse 2, and then the 7 days bring order. And then at the end he said, and so God created the heavens and the earth in these 7 days. So we know that it's the period of time. Yeah, here's one. Mike's coming.
You briefly mentioned this, the image, word image in Genesis 1. Could you speak more to the significance of God giving us his image and what that means in ancient cosmology?
Right. The image of God is given as an act of God. It's not something that evolves, that we inherit in that sense. It's not biological or neurological. The image of God is given by God, and it pertains to a number of different things. It pertains to a function that we have. That is, we are to subdue and rule, and that's because we've been enlisted by God with that function, and that's one part of the image of God. Another part of it is our identity. Our identity is we are the images of God, and that gives us an identity and the way to think about ourselves. We can also talk in terms of substitution. We are standing in for him. All of these issues, which again, I could spend a lot of time on, but yeah. The important part is that all the capacities like self-awareness and consciousness of God, those are things that are capacities that help us live as God's images, but they are not themselves, in my understanding, the image of God. As I talk about these things, it's not my intention to persuade you that you have to think the way I do. It's to put information on the table so that you can see that there's more to think about. Yes, sir.
So Paul said Christ is the last Adam. So can you explain that?
Sure. Christ is the last Adam. That doesn't mean he's biologically the last. It means he's archetypally the last. It's about his identity. And so Christ as the last Adam is not biological. We don't need to think of Adam as the first Adam, as biological. He's the first significant human for why? Well, I can't explain that now. You have to read the book.
All right, I'll ask the last question. You said that the creation narrative is about agency, not mechanism, but there are some versions of evolution that say there's no agency in the world. There's no, the chance has to be, or evolution has to be a chance, random process. So does that raise a contradiction between?
Well, it certainly would. If anyone, an evolutionist or anybody else, suggests there's no agency in the world, we disagree with them. The Bible screams agency, and that's what we believe, that there's a God who is the agent. Okay, but evolution doesn't require that. Evolution itself is a mechanism. And it's a mechanism that can operate under the administrative work of God if he chooses to do that. Okay, so in that sense, it's not inherently problematic. It's only problematic when certain people who hold to that as a mechanism also say that there is no agency. But that's no longer a scientific statement. That's a metaphysical statement. And they're outside their pay grade.
Let's thank Dr. Walton.